You're listening to PatchBay on TYM KRS.
Welcome to PatchBay, a show where we like to talk about sort of our inside look into the industry of basically turning sound into stuff that can be passed around, I guess. I'm Whisker. I produce a whole bunch of shows for Toymaker Television. And my co-host here is Shane. Shane, what do you do?
I'm a recording engineer who works at Sunshine Records and Pot and Gold Studios, and in my spare time I do a podcast with you, and I've been slowly working on doing some research for a possible book in the next little while, so although I'm still in the research phase right now, but it'll be about the history of Sunshine Records, as it were.
Interesting.
That's what I do. Yeah. Well, they were around since 1974, so there's lots of history. They've been kicking around that idea. Anyway, so the quick news is, prior to us getting started on the discussion, I'm not sure if there's any digital Perfomer fans out there, but they've just released their newest version, which is, I believe, version 8, and the GUIs look incredible. Not that that really means a whole lot, but I like cute-looking GUIs. I don't know about you.
I mostly think that the GUI needs to get out of my way.
Yeah. For me, if it looks like a phaser and it looks like a stomp box, I'm even more excited about it. Even though it really doesn't have any bearing on the sound whatsoever, I tend to get excited about it anyway. Which is like exactly when the Mac or Apple version of Logic came out, because before it was owned by eMagic. When the Apple version came out, I was like, oh my god, that looks so cool. Just because of the GUIs.
One thing I will give the nice GUIs is that when you're first picking up a new plugin or DAW or something like that, and you're not quite sure how to use it, and most of us audio guys, we're not really the reading the directions sort.
No.
Sort of the turn some knobs and see what it does sort. It's a lot easier to pick up these things when they sort of look like the real equipment.
Yeah.
Because you already know what it does if you've seen it in a rack, and yeah, it makes it easier to approach than some arbitrary number on a slider.
Yeah, I've never liked the audio unit plugins for that case. Although a lot of the audio, because it's open-ended, there's a lot of great audio unit plugins out there. And it's not that I need the GUI, but I mean, for client's sake, sometimes like, ooh, it looks like a tape machine. Ooh, it must sound better. Which it's never the case whatsoever. But sometimes I think to a degree it does have an effect on what the client thinks anyway. I don't know if that makes much sense, but yeah. I know I've had to do auto-tuning, with a VST version of auto-tune, and on a different DAW I was using Reaper versus using the regular auto-tune, and I had the same client, and he was like, oh, that's auto-tune, and then he was aware of it because he knew exactly what it looked like from videos that he saw, versus when I pulled that before, he didn't even know I was auto-tuning him. So I guess sometimes it can be a hindrance if you're not trying to tell them that you're doing that. Anyway.
Around here, it sort of depends on the day, but some days my GUI is a breadboard and a bunch of wires that I can plug into it. So I don't know. I guess I don't really feel the need for things to be super fancy. I look at the audio waveforms more as in their actual electrical sense. And when you digitize it, as long as they do a good job at maintaining the metaphor, if you will, to how you're actually affecting frequency and amplitude and all that sort of thing, then I pretty much enjoy a plug-in. But yeah, I'm just as comfortable, throwing a 10 microfarad capacitor into a circuit and knowing what that'll do. So I don't know.
Yeah. It's good, definitely good to have the ins and outs of that part of it, because for me, I know the difference between a DBX160 and 1176, but as far as what the difference in the capacitors are concerned, I'm not entirely aware of it. I don't know why it sounds different. I just know that I'd sooner have a 1176 on a kick and a 160 on a bass 9 times out of 10. But to bring it down to what's inside it, I don't know if I would. I mean, I guess it depends too on the makes, because a lot of them, changed over time too, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know if I would pick something just personally. I would pick it on what worked for me in the past. Is more for the experience. Although it is kind of a cool idea to think about tailoring stuff to specific, like if your best bass guitar sound would be going through a homemade compressor, and you dicked with the idea of what caps and resistors they used in certain equipment, kind of a thing. You could build something that would tailor to exactly what you were looking for every single time, if you wanted to have it every single time, I guess. But
what sort of got me interested in that side of things is I have a couple of old Hammond organs, and they're from the early 50s, and they need a lot of love from time to time. They're old tube equipment with wax paper caps and all that sort of thing. And I have two of them that match one another, and they sound completely different to each other. And the reason for this is because the capacitors age differently, and the different materials, they degrade over time depending on humidity and all that sort of thing. And I think a lot of the magic and mojo, if you will, of older audio equipment that we all love is that some of it ages very gracefully, and the older it gets, the more, I don't know if broken is the right word, but from an electrical point of view, broken is the accurate word. It gets more and more problematic, but the problems that arise are ones that sound really, really interesting and fun and cool. And knowing how to replicate that and build your own little homebrew stuff is a really fun trick to know, I think.
That brings up a few different ideas in my brain. One of them is the guys that like fuzz boxes that have actual geranium transistors versus just whatever kind of transistors there are out there. I know there's a group of guitar players that will only buy fuzz bases with, reproduction geranium transistors. And I'm guessing that's based on the sound situation. But more to your point, you were talking about how when stuff gets degraded, part of, say, that degradation is, a connection is starting to get looser, which is changing the amount of voltage that is going through or whatever, which changes the sound. And if you go in and you take all the solder off and refix the joint and resolder it, it's obviously not going to sound exactly the same as it was if it had gotten older, right?
Yeah, like on those old organs, if I were to take out all of the capacitors in its tone generator, it would change it from being a dark, moody tone to being very, very bright, sparkly. It would sound brand new. But you know what? The organ sounds really cool being moody and dark like that, so I wouldn't do that. And it's knowing those sort of things, the electrical side of things, that can allow you to maintain or change, musical instruments, audio equipment, that sort of thing. I don't know. Right. I'm no expert on it, but I do like to tinker.
Yeah, well, and that's the only way you're going to learn, obviously. The other thing I was going to point out, too, was there are certain Fender guitars, like the early set of Fender guitars, all the pickups were wound by 3 different girls in the plant. And guys could tell, like super snobs could tell who wired which pickups, because the more you wired it, the thicker it would be. The less you wired it, the more brighter it would be. And so certain ladies would do 12 wraps, one would do 15 or whatever it was, and they always tend to stick to the same amount. So not only are those old guitars really expensive just to buy, but there's certain guys who are chasing down the 1958, 59 model of disc ladies. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
Which is super snobby, but I mean, it makes sense if you've got that kind of money to burn, go right ahead. Whatever, but yeah. Did you want to switch and talk about DAWs?
Well, to me, I think it's the same topic. It's all about being able to dial things in the way that you want to, and a good DAW sort of, I don't know, like I said, gets out of my way and lets me tailor all the waveforms to fit into the slots that I want them to fit into. I really appreciate the ability to just get right down in there and and dial that sort of thing. And honestly, I haven't found a DAW that I like yet.
For me, it's really about workflow. For me, trying to do stuff quickly. I've gotten to the point where I'm like an editing machine on Pro Tools. Like, I'm very good at using other recording programs, or at least getting the gist of it, in a reasonable amount of time. But like, there's been times where I've thought about switching to a different DAW at work and or at home. But the way I feel about it is, if I'm going to use one at home, I should probably try and use the same thing at. Excuse me, 1 second. Try and use the same DAW at work and at home, just for the sake of bringing stuff back and forth. But like I was saying about Logic earlier, and when it first came out, I was really excited about it, because you could build it the way you wanted it to work, But for me, Pro Tools, I've just gotten to the point now where I'm so good at it, I don't even want to consider going to something else, because I've used it for so long, which is weird to say, but there's stuff that's definitely better. I don't know if have you ever heard much about Propellerhead software?
I see it mentioned here and there. I haven't had a chance to use it, though.
They just came out with a program, and it was about 2 years now, about a year and a half, called Record. It's genius, like absolutely genius. I've tried it a few times. You need a super fast computer, despite what they say, because it's all native processing. Despite what they say, you need a ridiculously fast computer. But there's a video, we might want to put it in the show notes, for Record, like their sort of by Record. Here's the reasons why. It's basically not a DAW for engineers, it's a DAW for musicians, basically. But as an engineer standpoint, it has everything that I ever look for, like editing, onboard amp sims, reverb, whatchamacallit, I can't think of the name of that kind of reverb, impulse response reverb, and just recreations of stuff. And the only bugger of Record is that you can't use any third-party plugins.
Ouch.
So the plugins you get, yes, are the ones that come with the program. However, it's all rewire. It's made by the same guys that do Reason, so you can rewire in and use anything you can use with Reason. So the thing about not having the ability to use other plugins isn't necessarily a bad idea, because you should really be able to create something with what you have in front of you. My personal opinion, the whole point of going and getting all these different compressors, for, let's say, if you're one platform, you can get 1,000 different types of compressors. You're getting to the point of overkill, I think, to a degree. I mean, in reality, you can probably get away with using 1 to 3 different kinds. That's my personal opinion. I mean, 9 times out of 10, when I'm in Pro Tools, I'm either using my the regular Digirac plugins, the Bomb Factory plugins, or the Massey plugins. That's all I use. They're only the 3, like, other than a few that I bought. And the idea behind like sort of stopping yourself to say, this is what you're allowed to do, and that's it. So you gotta figure out a way to make do with it at that point. I kind of like like being constricted a little bit for that.
Yeah, it totally works. I mean, it's always been a great inspiration for any artistic endeavor to sort of limit the rules of the world that you can move in. In compressors, I would say that it's probably a really good idea to stick to 1 or 2 of them, because they're such fickle little things, and if you can learn the compressor that you use and become a grand master of it, you can get a much better sound with that limited selection of equipment, or digital equipment, however you want to think about it, and do things with it that you would just you'd end up going through a whole bunch of different compressors looking for one that sounded the way you want. But if you can pretty much run one and do magic with it, then you don't need to have a big pool of them.
Yeah, exactly. Like, just speaking that to when I first started, I was using Digital Performer, and the one compressor that came stock with Digital Performer, they had Mass audio system, MAS, which was like sort of their version of RTAS type plugins. And the ones that came stock, I think the lowest attack time I could get was still something like 100 milliseconds, which is like at that point I just didn't even use compressors, like because there was no, excuse me, for me, every time I do any kind of compression, it's like the quickest attack possible. So like I'm using like point 0.1 like millisecond for an attack time. So using it like for that for me was just like I just didn't even use a compressor, because when I use them I go for it. Like it's just what it's doing is it's catching things. It's not over compressing. It's not under compressing, but it's just catching those little sort of peaks and stuff like that. And when you have an attack time that's super slow, then you're dicking around with, oh, how much should the attack time be versus the release, and it's a lot of farting around. So the way I've sort of always kind of gone after it, I've sort of went with the quickest attack possible, so that like if it's going to hit, it'll hit right now, not in 200 milliseconds from now, because just now it went over the threshold. Do you know what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And when you get into more advanced techniques like side chaining and stuff like that, you're really sort of getting into the real power of the thing there.
hmm Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, and if you have a wickedly slow attack time and you're trying to do a side chain, there's no sense even trying to do it. You might as well work with the latency in your computer and run it through an actual compressor, which I've done, and then just moved waveforms back. Like, so yeah, I guess the one thing about using the stock plugins that would come with a system, if they're not really up to snuff as far as engineering geekery is concerned, well then you definitely want to start looking somewhere else. I mean, for me, like with the Pro Tools ones, they're basically like they're up to snuff. It's just, you know, any of the other ones you buy, they're like computer versions of something. Like, does the Bomb Factory 1176 sound like a real 1176? No, not at all. Does it have sort of the same color? Yeah. Would I sooner use an 1176 on every channel that I want to use one? Yeah, but I don't have $3,000 for every. That's basically what it comes down to for every. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So at work, you end up using Pro Tools a lot?
Yeah, it's 95% of the time it's Pro Tools. I do use Bias Peak as a 2-track editor, um, but they just actually went out of business just a little while ago, which kind of blows. But I'm still good. I'm supported, and I've actually used Reaper a bit at work for doing some remix stuff, or when somebody brings me in more tracks than the Pro Tools that I use. I'm allowed 32 tracks on the system I'm running, so which once again it's nice to have constricts, but sometimes I'll have something like that. The cool thing about Reaper is it allows a rewire, so I've actually rewired stuff, used Pro Tools as the master, and had Reaper sidechaining, say the drum mix or something like that, so I could do, you know, VSTs or something like that on the drums, have 16-channel drums coming in, rewired to Pro Tools, and then have Pro Tools running the other 32 tracks, but that gets confusing. But yeah, 9 times out of 10 in Pro Tools. What are you using over there?
For the podcasts, I tend to stick to, and you might find this funny, but it works really, really well. The newest version of GarageBand on a brand new Mac Mini.
Oh,
And
slick.
the reason why I like it so much is that it has the audio units plug-in system, and I can drop in Guitar Rig
Nice.
2.
I like Guitar Rig.
And Guitar Rig 2 is basically, for those of you who haven't used it, it basically allows you to stack a bunch of outboard equipment um, into basically a virtual rack and just wire it all together. And yeah, the plugins of the rack equipment are all very, 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 very useful because they allow you to get right down into. It depends. I mean, I've been using it for so many years. I can do things with it that that you would probably, I mean, it's basically magic, is what most people say when they've heard what the podcast audio sounds like from the callers before I do it and after I do it using just my standard rack of guitar rig stuff. I can do audio magic with it. So I really like that. I mean, as far as the functionality of GarageBand itself, that's not really why I'm there. The interface is nice and it comes with the computer, so I don't have to invest a whole lot of extra money in it. And then I use the real meat there happens in Guitar Rig.
So here's a silly question: How are you running latency? It was through the I/O you're using, right?
There's basically, when we do this live stuff, there's only as much latency as it takes for it to get in and out of the computer out to Skype. So when you hear me, any latency you're hearing is network latency and not, audio latency in the system, because Macs are so good at being snappy with audio.
Yeah.
And I have a good dedicated hardware to do the routing of signals around, so that helps a lot too. Yeah,
no, for sure. Yeah, that was the one thing I did have trouble with on Garage. I think it was the original version of GarageBand I was running. So I had a little bit of trick with the latency, just trying to lay down guitar parts and stuff like that, so that it was still in time with, what you were actually listening back to, right? Just give me 1 second, okay? Pardon. Yeah, so I was gonna mention. So other than using GarageBand, that's basically all you're using as far as recording and editing is concerned, or you're using some other extraneous things?
Well, that's what I use here. We have a dedicated studio for the podcast stuff at the top floor of the Tymkrs building here.
Right.
And so
Tymkrs Tower.
Yeah, we have multiple recording studios in the house, basically. We have this one, which is where we record all of our podcasts and TV shows, and it's all sort of set up to do that job really well. But then the weird, fun hackery always happens over in my office, where I've got it set up with a Windows machine and a little 2-channel audio interface from TC Electronic, Firewire sort of deal. And because I don't do any multi-tracking more than 2 tracks at a time in there, it works completely fine. And it basically allows me to do things like hook up a whole bunch of random electronics projects and get them right into the computer and track them. And then
confirm that they're working and
yada. The recording system that I use there is usually Audacity, actually. And that's open source sort of multi-track DAW program for Windows, probably Mac, and it's on Linux. So yeah, Audacity is really good tool out there if you don't want to spend any money on your DAW, but you still want to be able to get right down and edit waveforms and such.
Actually, if you don't want to spend any money whatsoever and you can get around the latency problem with any kind of interface you're using Reaper and Audacity, you can pretty much do everything that you need to do. The real trick is trying to hear back something and be able to record to in time properly. Like if you track drums and then you lay down guitar parts to make sure that you're hearing everything as it's being recorded, and you're not, by the time your signal gets to the hard drive, it's, 15 seconds past that point or whatever. Those 2 programs you can do a ton of stuff with, without having to spend anything. So they're both great programs. I use Audacity quite a lot too at work. I have it on my other system in my office because I haven't been able to set up Peak on it. It's basically the same thing, although Peak is only stereo 2-track and Audacity, obviously. I can't remember how many tracks does it allow you.
Oh, I'm not sure that it's limited that way. I'm probably sure it has a lot more to do with how much memory you have than how much it's willing to do. But I'm not sure. I haven't really pushed it that far.
Oh, okay. Well, I know I've been able to open at least 8 on it.
Easily, yeah.
Mono tracks. So Yeah, I guess, yeah, well, it's native. It probably, see, that's the thing. Some of those programs give you a hard limit as to how many tracks you're allowed to play
Yeah, it
back.
being open source, I mean, a lot of those kinds of controls are just sort of left out, I guess.
They leave them out. Yeah, if you've got the shit to be able, or if you have the computer to be able to handle it, it'll play back as many tracks as you want, basically. Um, yeah. Although, 9 times out of 10, for me anyway, anytime I have more than 24 tracks, I usually start trying to edit and mute stuff because somebody's went overboard. At least that's the way it's usually happened for me anyway.
Yeah. For live tracking music type of stuff in here, we just stick with the Mac. And that's because of latency and, when you're playing along, you really need to have, if your drums are tracked digitally, you need to have that coming out as snappy as possible or you're going to have to move things around and that's no fun.
When you track two digital drums, are you listening back to the audio or are you listening back to MIDI?
Listening back to the audio output, and it works really well because the Mac is so good with the latency. It works just fine.
So, but are you listening to a stereo track that's been recorded into your computer, or are you listening to the MIDI being triggered through a sampler and then that audio?
Yeah, you've got your MIDI track in GarageBand, and you can set GarageBand up to loop it.
Yeah.
Um, and it generates the sound real time, sends it right back
Okay.
out through the interface, and we've got it piped through our monitoring system here. And yeah, I mean, we haven't had any problems with latency because it's, unlike working with Windows, it's so small that it's not usually audible.
No, yeah. I mean, normally I set my buffer at 64 in my Mac, and I don't have a problem whatsoever in Pro Tools. Um, I have, however, had problems with really hardcore MIDI guys when I play back a MIDI track, and what I tend to do is I will any MIDI instruments. I will, especially if I'm recording more MIDI, I will convert all the MIDI to audio tracks and then mute the MIDI tracks and just play back the audio tracks of each individual. So if it's like, I import 8 tracks of MIDI and there's like drums, bass, some kind of synth guitar thing or whatever, I'll convert those all to audio tracks, play them back, and then record extra MIDI. For whatever reason, I'll tend to run into some weirdo, and it's not because the stuff's on the wrong channel when he's recording or anything like that, but I just tend to have less in Pro Tools. I have less latency problems when it's playing back audio when you're recording more audio versus playing back MIDI for whatever reason. And it's not just about software synths. Sometimes we're talking about pumping the MIDI, definitely pumping the MIDI back through the synthesizer and then back into Pro Tools on an auxiliary or something like that. Of course,
Fun.
you have to deal with, yeah, you'd have to deal with a little bit of millisecond stuff. So what I tend to do is try and work from audio as much as possible. I mean, you have the MIDI, so you can always go back. If something needs to be edited or changed or whatever, but I'd sooner mix all audio if I can. Like mixing MIDI and audio, it just becomes so much more time consuming for me.
Yeah. So if I had like if somebody else was paying for it, I'd probably have a much more powerful Mac sitting here with Logic and maybe a new Thunderbolt Symphony I/O. That would be fun.
Well, yeah, I mean it really comes down to what's going to work for you, right? Like for me, I've been able to make do a lot on like doing full productions on what I'm using, which is basically um, a glorified home studio in some places. I've much more sexier mics in a big room and stuff like that. But what's come down to for me is I've managed all the latency type stuff and things like that. But I need to get a few more extra inputs coming in, and that's where I'm right now in big research trying to figure out what's the best thing for preamps and stuff like that for me anyway, as far as a good solution.
All right. Well, we are out of time for this week.
We are.
Interesting conversation anyway.
That one got slightly derailed, but it was good.
You guys can find the show every week at patchbay.tv. Put it up on Fridays. It's yeah, you can just click play on the page there. I also put up a couple RSS feeds there. One will automatically subscribe you on iTunes, and the other one is one that you can use on your phone and that sort of thing. If you want to set it up for that. Anyway, that's it for us for this week. We'll be back next week. Bye.